The idea of working with different sources of inspiration has always appealed to me. And so the idea of working with sound as a different kind of input was really quite appealing to me.
Never thought about sound and using it visually. So when this Aural Textiles call came up, I was thinking, that could be really interesting, you know? And it has actually changed my whole work in practice.
I've been involved in the project, I think, 3 years from the beginning. And everyone's sort of like, oh my God, that's what it's about. And like, yeah, I think there's a really nice kind of narrative and story around it, and people that really draws people in because it is something different, and I really like that.
So I first got involved in the Aural Textiles project via Lynn. She let me know about her idea, and her and George had this concept of encouraging and inspiring design in a really modern way using sounds that have been recorded in the local environment.
I am a hand weaver based in Aberdeen City, and in 2017 went to a workshop up at the Glasgow School of Arts Highlands and Islands campus just outside Forres on circular economy in the textile industry. So it was thinking about taking what's considered waste stream from textile manufacturing and thinking about ways that makers might be able to work with it. And it was while I was there that one of George's colleagues introduced the two of us.
I was doing some research work for the Glasgow School of Art out on the islands. I took out my sound recorder and began to just record the sounds of the birds, particularly on the Machar. And when looking at the spectrograms of these bird songs, you end up seeing the actual sound pattern of that bird song. A spectrogram is basically a type of audio visualization that looks at the entire frequencies of an audio clip and displays those in their kind of respective space and time format. And it was in that point where I thought, I wonder if these patterns could be recreated in either knitting or weaving. Take that visualization, clean it up, focus in, find a unique pattern.
Make a sound that is nostalgic or emotional, to take something and to be able to effectively immortalise it. So to have that object that's there as a permanent reminder of a transient moment in time, but also to have it as a talking point. So as soon as we started talking about it, it was one of those instant, yes, of course, that makes perfect sense, and absolutely we can do that. When I first started with the knitted samples, it really was just a case of taking the spectrogram, pixelating it, and then translating that directly, stitch by stitch, to a knitted pattern. But when it came to taking it onto the loom, it was much less about trying to recreate the shape in the fabric and more about using the shape to direct how the loom was set up. We demonstrated that you could do it with knitted fabrics. We'd also demonstrated that there was design potential for woven fabrics. So actually what happened if we took it into other textile disciplines, but also if you gave it to different knitters and different weavers.
So Lynn and I decided to apply to a grant of the Royal Society of Edinburgh to see if we could gather a group of practitioners from around Scotland and introduce them to this sound to textile pattern making process and see what came of it. What we really wanted to do was to make it as simple and as open sourced as possible so that anybody could take that sound of anything that they wanted, from bird song to machine sounds to sounds of people and voices, and use it as the data for their work.
I think for me, it was the fact that they were looking for textile makers, and not having worked with textile makers before, I found that a really interesting proposition.
I was really interested in how a sound of place can kind of connect you deeper to where you are, and so it made sense, this project, to have a look at to have a look at the sounds of the landscape and incorporate that into work.
The Aural Textiles project began then with our 6 practitioners. 2 of them were weavers, 2 of them were kniters, and 2 of them were screen printers. We had given them different approaches to working with the sounds, but basically shared with them that sound to pattern process.
Yeah, that first phase was great, just sort of forming that wee unit of 6 of us, and sharing ideas and different processes and practices, and learning about what other people were doing within their own practice was really, really great.
The first stages of working on the project were really about tuning in to sound more and appreciating that part of my environment more, which I hadn't really paid very much attention to at all, and realising what are the sounds that I hear all the time and just screen out.
When we had done our initial explorations, just George and I together, it was very much about the spectrograms and the data. When we presented it to those first group of 6 textile practitioners, again, it was very kind of spectrogram data focused, and they did work with them throughout that phase of the project. But by the end of it, there was, part of the learning that came out of that was that actually some of them were much more interested in having a more intuitive response to the sound, rather than that taking that kind of visualization step in the middle.
Prior to this project, I had a studio, and I guess my creative practice was focusing on screen printing. I joined the project. It was great because it gave my work a bit of focus. I think it really introduced me to working within a project team, and just, made me really realise that I really like to kind of bounce ideas off other people.
On this beautiful macha is where I spend most of my time, getting my inspiration for my small weaving business practice, creative practice. We were to partner up and share our practice collaboratively. And Beth and I think we just really loved our approach to painting and an approach to, our love of abstract art.
We decided that I'd go to visit her in Uist. So I spent a week there, and actually the weather was very wet and windy, so I had picked rain as a theme for me, and was able to get these amazing recordings of like the wind and rain battering against the windows and the chimney and everything in her house. That gave me some good sounds as a starting point. And then I think we also did a bit of visual exploration of that. So I think this is a drawing which, I guess is inspired by a spectrogram of one of those sounds of the wind and rain battering off the house. But then I got quite interested in bringing in a squeegee and replicating those kind of, visual symbols that were coming through from the spectrograms.
Initially, the sounds that we gathered were uploaded and created spectrograms, and this is how we got the patterning from it. But as Beth and I really enjoy exploring abstract expressionist themes, it just seemed a natural development to then go from the look of sound electronically, digitally, to then kind of embracing that idea of acting that through emotional response to sound. And then for me, the marram grass is an extension of that. So then I started doing these like little mini sculptures up here.
During that week, she took me down to the local beach and took a bunch of photographs, took loads of photographs all week. But I guess a couple of the images that really resonated with me, these were patterns in the sand of the different kind of colours of grains of sand. So then the kind of process to get them made up as screens for screen printing was to put them into Illustrator, do an image trace, and then you get this kind of pretty heavy black and white version, which then, so you can use that to develop a screen. So I guess that was what had developed as my kind of visual representation of wind and rain.
So when Beth was in North Uist last September, in September 2020, we just really brainstormed and we decided that we would make the work about the maca. The maca is a very unique ecosystem. It's under threat, and I really think it needs to be publicised. The birds that I have recorded, the skylark, the corn bunting, the corncrake, all of these really seriously threatened species need to be highlighted. And so my work is conceptual, and it's really about trying to show the threat of modern life and climate change and modern farming techniques, how it's really affecting and impacting the natural world. And I was looking at the ancient art of weaving. We wanted to incorporate all the natural materials. So I've got marram grass in there, pocketed in some of the weaving. Then I've got my wool. I've got hemp and I've got linen, and these are all plant-based fibres. And I'm just trying to look at ways of echoing that this is land and it's natural. But also we decided on a panel each, a hanging panel. I wanted to leave lots of areas of the warp exposed, trying to make it look as sort of rudimentary as possible, and to make it look really, really, really rustic, because that is a sort of metaphor for the way that our natural world is being destroyed. And my printed sound is actually the male skylark ascending. So when a skylark sings, what he does is he leaps up from the floor, and as he's ascending, he starts singing.
She had done these lovely drawings, which were inspired by her sculptures she'd made of the marram grass from the maca, and then basically she pinned these to her wall hanging so that I knew where the placement of them. So it was really just a case of kind of unrolling her woven piece and then gradually going through the process of printing each section.
And then Beth would have her panel is quite heavily printed because it was so windy and rainy.
Basically, I used the table here, and it was a case of pinning a section of the wall hanging down, and deciding, really making decisions about where I wanted the printed sections to be, working out whether I wanted to use the screen or then create something that was smaller or larger, or a variation, cutting out the stencils and then pinning everything down, printing it, drying it.
The maca is so fragile and so threatened, and even if we have all these conservation projects that are going on to try and protect it, it's still not enough because of climate change. So I do feel almost like some kind of I feel like a custodian.
I'm very drawn to water. I'm very drawn to water and to the places where the land and water meet. So Dundee is perfect for that. And I'm really interested in shapes that are made along a coastline or a river. And I'm interested in the fact that when we come along as humans and, we change that boundary and we impose grids on something that is not normally a grid. It's not normally straight lines, but we put our straight lines there. And it reminds me a little bit of weaving in itself, in that I'm taking flexible thread and I'm imposing a grid on it and I'm pushing it into its place, but the thread pushes back, and it's that tension between the structure of the cloth and what the thread wants to do that makes woven cloth so fascinating. to me. I love Jen's work and the graphic shapes that she uses, and the very clear lines in her work. And I felt there's a resonance in the things that we are both drawn to design-wise, but also we're both really quite geeky about processes and really interested in how designs become tangible objects and what you can do with different materials. Well, we started with a very strong idea about our end goal. We wanted to bring together our very different materials. Jen works with brass and I work with thread. We wanted to put them together and make an object that had both elements in it. And what combined metal and textile for us was the idea of a suit of armour, something wearable, a breastplate, chainmail, something like that we could create that would incorporate these two elements. And we had the idea of weaving the brass into the fabric. We felt that we needed to shape the brass for incorporating into the textile. But actually the shape that we designed turned out to be even better if you didn't incorporate it into the textile, if the brass became the textile itself. We've thought a lot in this project about protection. It's been a theme, obviously, that's been on everybody's minds for the last year or so. And so we've taken as our sound, we've taken the sound of hand washing, and we got other members of the Aural Textiles team to wash their hands for us and record the sound so that we could explore those patterns in our designs. We're working more with the sound wave patterns than with the spectrograms themselves. The sounds of hand washing don't make particularly interesting spectrograms, but they do make interesting wave patterns. And depending on whether somebody washes their hands very briskly or is slower and more methodical, you get a different shape coming through in the wave, which is something, again, that plays out very well in both Jen's brass designs and in the woven cloth. We decided to create this protective wardrobe that a sort of a priestess of safety might wear to perform her ritual hand washing or whatever it is that she needs to do. And so the chainmail made out of brass and yarn is one aspect of that. And I'm making a simple garment, a sort of tunic style dress that will have these echoes of the brass designs woven in silk in the fabric. So they're not a whole outfit, but pieces that you would select from the wardrobe depending on the occasion. It was really exciting when the different disciplines joined the project. I mean, it was wonderful to work with all textile makers. That was very exciting in its own way. But then to bring in these other crafts as well, it just turned it up a notch.
After the kind of success of that initial experiment, Lynn and I and the 6 practitioners decided that we would try for a bit more money and see if we could actually develop this idea further. And rather than just exploring it through textiles, we would explore it through a variety of arts and design engagements and collaborations. So we managed to get these 6 new practitioners, ceramicists, silversmith, furniture designers, all to come in and work with our 6 textile designers and makers and create what's called now the Distributed Capabilities Project. Distributed Capabilities is about encouraging hybrid ways of working and making. It's about opening up conversations between different design and arts disciplines.
So we wanted to make sure that it wasn't information and knowledge that George and I controlled, but actually it was something that could be sent out into the world and shared widely by anyone who wanted to use it. So that was what took us to the idea of having one of our original 6 textile practitioners pair up with somebody new, and actually then the responsibility for sharing the process fell to one of the original 6 textile practitioners. So they were then explaining the process to their new partner.
I'd known Lynn before the invitation to join the Aural Textiles project, and I knew that she was doing some really interesting work using sound and developing patterns from sound.
I just thought it was really exciting. I'd never heard about that before. I'd never thought about something like that.
I saw it advertised and I was really intrigued to be able to work and get to know other craft practitioners in the field.
We were asked to meet up in Huntly, and we had this kind of speed dating. It was almost like a speed dating setup.
There was different exercises that George and Lynn did with us, where we had to introduce ourselves, but you had like a minute to do it to each of the makers. And the idea was that by the end of that weekend, we'd all have kind of developed a collaborative pair or have an idea of who we'd like to work with.
And we knew that when we set up this cross-disciplinary element to the project, that we wanted it to be one of the original textile practitioners with somebody new who was from a different making discipline. Some of them paired up quite quickly, some of them paired up with more than one person, and carried that through to the very end of the project.
To see your sound as a visual it just opened up so many possibilities, and working with other people that were like-minded in the fact that, well, Beth, my partner in this project, we made a connection with the surface pattern that we both loved. Beth uses screen printing, and I was using screen printed enamels for my ceramics, and so there was lots of overlap in our techniques and our approaches. I have developed my own studio practice using predominantly slip cast process, so I make my own moulds and I use liquid clay into the moulds, and I cast geometric forms which I then decorate with surface decals. So I use enamel transfers based on the graphics of every day. So I might be inspired by the inside of an envelope or a barcode or something that I find on a piece of graphics, and I use that on the surface of my forms. The first time you came to the studio, you showed me how to screen print using paper stencils, and I showed you my practice, and then it just kind of naturally clicked that we think, all right, so we can do what you do on a tile, and then we thought, well, one of those puzzles would be quite interesting. Then we realised we had 9 other people that we could get inspiration from, and it just all fell into place.
The final piece is going to be a tile puzzle made of 11 tiles. Each tile will have a motif generated from a sound from each participant on the project. I can't remember who had the idea, but it was a bit like, it was like a light bulb moment when one of us did, and I guess it's just an extension of that collaboration. It's a way of involving everybody in the project into our kind of final piece. I think the sounds have been interesting. They've been mainly relating to people's practices. So mine is the noise of the squeegee. It's very much a noise that I associate with that moment before you lift the screen and then you see your result, which is the magical part about screen printing.
My sound was the kiln clicking on for the temperature and going up and up. So when you hear the click, you go, that's fine, it's working. So you know that it's ramping up, as they say.
Nettie sent us a cracker this week, which is her industrial sewing machine, which is like a drill. But it's sort of like an intermittent noise as well. Right. And then you've got some really gentle sounds.
So some people have really kind of shown us sums up what their practice is or their environment. So people, like Dwinman lives in such a beautiful place, and she's captured that with the bird, and the same for Marie. Yeah. So my part of the collaboration is I'm manipulating the sounds on Audacity and then putting the motifs onto the tiles. Experimenting with the Audacity, that became quite natural to me then. So you passed me the sounds that we'd collected from the other participants. I manipulated them on Audacity, and then passing them back to you, Beth, so that you were then able to use your skills and expertise on Illustrator.
This is one of the ones I've picked out for Callie. So my process in Illustrator is to bring that into the application and do an image trace of it. And so that's the actual image, and then that's a couple of different variations which have been image traced with slightly different settings. And then what I'm doing is I'm zooming right in and picking out like an area of interest, and then taking that from there. So I've taken that one, and then blowing them up, so enlarging them. And then what we've been doing, so it's really nice because Laura's starting the process, I'm working in the middle, and then I've been providing her 2 options, and then she's choosing the preferred one. And then I'm creating that into like a 15 centimetre tile motif, which is the size of tiles we're going to be working with. The idea of the tile puzzle, it will sit in a wooden frame. There'll be a space so that you can move the tiles around. So actually the initial idea when we thought we were going to be able to hold an in-person exhibition was that folks visiting the exhibition could interact with it and actually create their own image by moving the tiles around.
Obviously, if we had people to come and contribute and to interact with it, that would be really exciting to see what sound these people would, what the visitors would create. And I think that's the kind of missing part of the puzzle.
So I'm going to create a printed version of it. So basically by making paper stencils, which are the same as the
transfers.
As the enamel transfers that Laura will be cutting out to put onto the tiles. And so I'll use those paper stencils to make a screen printed version, so like a printed panel that will stand alongside, be hung alongside the tile puzzle in the exhibition. That's really cool, that one.
It's like figures.
Yeah. But yeah, they're all from the same sound, which I think is really interesting.
I've been running a ceramics practice for quite a long time now, and I used to run a very commercial tile business, but really over the last while I've been much more interested in making work that is installation based or sculptural or is dealing with a very specific subject.
The focus of my business is to produce hand-dyed yarn for people who enjoy hand knitting and to also create designs for people who enjoy hand knitting. The dyes that I create for that yarn are not only natural dyes, but they're sustainable natural dyes. They are made using materials that are gathered from the material around me without harming this beautiful environment, but also reusing waste materials from other local businesses. I'm trying to reduce waste and work in the most sustainable way possible. And one of the kind of really interesting kind of reasons why I wanted to desire to be paired with someone who worked in ceramics is because I think we share a lot in terms of the approach to our art being really tactile. Ceramic artists are constantly looking for things that create kind of touches and sensory experiences.
Dwynwen and I met and quite immediately connected on some of the subject matter that we'd both been working on. So some of my earlier ceramic pieces deal with memory and dementia.
Professionally, I had previously worked with people and their families who were living with dementia. Music can be particularly useful and therapeutic, and so can be helpful in comforting people and drawing out interaction with them, even when they lose the ability to speak or remember certain people and activities and places.
So together we quite quickly decided we wanted to explore visually where things are lost, so memories or senses.
We found a common thread for the piece of work that we were doing in terms of incorporating the sounds of community in our work.
So the sound that we particularly connected to was the sound of music. particularly more traditional ceilidh music, as something that is so deeply sort of in your memory, that even when your other senses and your other memories are missing, you can often connect to sound in a way that you might not other things. So we use that as our starting point.
Working with the idea of the ceilidh steps, the first thing I do is create accurate representations in charts and knitted samples that precisely represented the steps of a ceilidh dance. So, for example, twists and turns would be represented by cable crossing stitches. Promenading forth and back would be represented by columns of stitches. And the first samples were unbroken, accurate representations so that you could follow the dance almost as instructions if you were to follow a tactile set of instructions.
So in our exhibition, we'll have some beautiful hats that she's knitted that actually have dance patterns around them. Just a beautiful sort of sense of taking something which is quite difficult, but then transforming it into something really beautiful and something wearable as well, something comforting that keeps your head warm.
To incorporate the experience of a person living with dementia into the knitted ceilidh pieces, what I did was cut the pieces and then they could unravel and be pulled apart to represent the gaps that appear in somebody's memory when they're experiencing dementia. I also made some new pieces and dropped stitches, so deliberately missed a stitch during a row and the stitch begins to unravel, and that represents the experience somebody has of grasping for a memory. The other thing I did was make some pieces which then had stitches grouped together to make a bobble or a big lump in the piece, and then carry on. And that represents an experience of dementia where somebody can be fine for a long period of time and then they have a dementia event that's very specific, that is disruptive, and then their life can carry on again. So after creating these pieces, what I did was pass them on to Carol, who went through a process of exploring and pressing them into clay.
So these are some of the sample pieces that I created just to sort of get a sense of what that knitting can produce. And I particularly liked the black glaze because I thought that really emphasised the beautiful shapes in the knitting without it being obviously knitting.
What that does is represent the experience of living with dementia and the way that affects the people who are loving and caring for those people. That it's not just an experience that is held within one individual, it is pressing and impacting on the lives of people around them, their friends and their family. And that's shown through the impacts and the dips and whirls that are in Carol's pieces.
So the pieces I then developed, I've got sort of two quite different pieces. These pieces in black have the knitting sort of wrapped around them. You can see I've also sort of carved into it to increase that sense of holes and things that are missing, but also creating it into a bowl shape because a bowl is a container. So it's that sort of sense of containing a memory as well as something being lost a little bit around the edges. This white piece is unglazed porcelain. It's very thin. And it comes from a shawl that Dwinwen knitted. And I've created this piece with a very gentle curve as a sort of a sense of something that's sort of wrapping around you and quite comforting. And yet it still has these lovely areas where it represents the drop stitches and the bits that are missing. And the translucency of the porcelain is lovely for also enhancing that sense of things that are fragile and breaking away. Obviously, we've been a bit restricted in the exhibition because of of COVID and the things that we can't really have an exhibition that people will touch.
It's interesting having had that element in the middle, an ongoing element even of like the pandemic part, where then everybody had it kind of forced upon them, even if they were living down the road from each other. It's still then that different perspective. Oh, hang on, we've got to carry on this conversation and develop something, but you mean we can't go to each other's studios?
I think we were really lucky that we had met up in person way back at the start of the project, and it's always been the meeting in person which has pushed this project forward, which has been interesting to learn, because I think when you're trying to meet up on Zoom, it's all very well when you're in the moment, but as soon as you come off the computer, it's hard to get things done because life takes over and other jobs get in the way. So it's been tricky, I think, doing a long distance collaboration.
I think partly because our starting point was so rooted in the materials that we actually found it quite difficult to not have our hands on each other's work. That was a really important driver for us. And without that, it's been quite difficult to keep the momentum going.
On some level, it's sort of been unfortunate, but then on another level, it's just required all of us just to step up and like answer the phone and be available when questions come up, because we can't be in the same room together. In a way, I think it's made us quite clear and direct, and to be able to articulate and be really clear about what each of us individually want to contribute and can contribute to the project. So maybe in some ways it's made it easier.
I think actually this kind of remote way of working is opening up a whole chance for people to get to know each other more. And so converting my artistic practice and collaborating to online just seemed like a very natural way of working.
I'm somebody who kind of believes in collaboration so much that I've been facilitating it for other people. But Aural Textiles was a chance for me to become a collaborator. So I got a bit greedy and collaborated with 2 people. So when we started the project, we were all kind of introducing ourselves to one another, and we were asked to take a piece of work. So this was the piece of work I took with me. And I said to people, I would really like to, I'm obsessed with circles. I use them all the time in my work. They kind of symbolise everything and nothing, and I really like that kind of aspect of them. But I'd quite like to use other shapes. So that was the kind of challenge I set. So when Olive and I started working together, we were looking for other shapes and playing. And with our collaboration, we've looked at lots of possibilities. And what we realised was that every time we got together, even on the phone, in person, we spent a lot of time laughing. And so it just occurred to us, laughter was actually the really interesting common thread. And actually, particularly working through lockdown, it was such a bit of a godsend really to have Olive to laugh with, when we were all kind of up against it and thinking, this is a crazy world. So laughter was really important. So we recorded laughter, and then we used the Audacity to investigate the pattern. And lo and behold, when you look at it in that level of magnification, you uncover a series of lines and circles. And we were back at circles. And in addition to that, when I had gone to visit Olive, when we first started chatting about what we would do, she introduced me to her punch card patterns that she uses for her knitting. So these sample pieces that she knitted for me are actually based on a random set of circles. I took this pattern from the original ceramic, and then she knitted it. So we couldn't get away from circles. We just couldn't get away from them. So the piece that we're making is a series of circles. The ceramic element is the circle piece that I'm making. And then Olive is creating these hanging battens, and she's wrapping them in textile. It's a technique that a lot of textile artists use to sample colours and see how they look together. And the inspiration for that really is, again, another version of the spectrogram and a particular way of looking at the sound. You get lots of lines which come in variations of shades of blues and pinks, and so that's the kind of inspiration for these stripy effects, if you like. But again, it's really playing to Olive's command of the colour spectrum. When we were all together, Olive had introduced everybody to the idea of the punch card and had asked them all to make the sounds that they were working with into punch cards for her to knit up samples. So she knitted little samples like this for everyone. And we've used these knitted samples as the basis of the designs that we're working on. Some of them we've enlarged, some of them we've abstracted, some of them we have taken quite literally. But of course, each time we kind of interpret and iterate them, we get a slightly different version.
I've been involved in furniture making for 25 years. I'm really interested in different craft techniques and incorporating them into my work. I'm specifically quite interested in chair design and construction specifically because I really love the scale and the immediacy of the objects and how people engage with them. And I also, seating provides a really fantastic vehicle for looking at and incorporating lots of different elements from design and structure and ergonomics and practicality and form and function, and then the sort of the proof is in the pudding when people sit in them. Yeah. And you can tell because the body doesn't lie. I had met Olive previously at some craft fairs, and I just really, I loved what she did. It's like the whole element of pattern and how she incorporates pattern and colour into the knitted textiles that she produces. Olive had spent a reasonable amount of time developing an idea when I stepped in and joined with her to work on the collaborative process. And so the sound that was picked was the sound of Olive using her knitting machine. We took the conical shapes of those frequencies and we developed those into 3 dimensions. And the way that we decided to do that was to develop spiral constructions and then integrate the weave process, which Olive does, into the spirals. I use Rhino as a computer program to generate the drawings and then just import them into the CNC computer. You work out the cutting and the drilling sequences and then put a sheet of plywood onto the bed of the CNC and then it cuts sequentially. I really love the directionality and the movement contained within the spiral, so I was quite keen to do that. And this is like a very simple one that was just cut on the bandsaw. These were very formative experiments. We were looking at different ways to incorporate the textiles into them. So we explored this one. This is like a double spiral here, which I thought was really fascinating. This one's wrapped as opposed to woven. So we sort of decided that actually what we would do is that we would have this quite fairly transparent. But I think once it's wrapped in its entirety, that there'll be some really lovely patterns that occur between looking through the object.
Every discipline thinks in a different way, which was something that was so nice doing this project.
I think that there's a huge amount of value in seeing how other artists work and approach their work, and it sort of opens your eyes to different possibilities, sort of conceptually and practically.
I think collaboration is really powerful, and particularly over this last time, while we've all been in lockdown, it's just brilliant to have connections with other people and to help that kind of stimulate ideas when you might be feeling a bit unsure.
I think it's the way ahead for the arts. I think that people need to work more together. I think that people need to be more open And I think it's the way ahead for all creative industries, that they inform one another, they inspire one another.
I've lived in Ness for about 15 years and I'm a quilt maker. So I moved up here to train as a quilt maker. And then I specialised in using Harris tweed, making contemporary Harris tweed quilts. And I know when I first met Orla, she had a huge beaming smile and was just really, really bubbly. And I just thought you just got really lovely energy and just chatty and easygoing. So I knew I liked her as a person. I mean, they're all great people as people, and all amazing designers and makers. But I think it was just when talking to her and then seeing images of her work, I just thought that's completely different to mine.
I'm currently based in Callander, and I work between landscape painting and textile design. So I come from a screen printing background, and I studied textiles, printed textiles and embroidery at Edinburgh College of Art. Nettie had already started a project which was looking at mapping the shipping forecasts, and she'd been doing this before Aural Textiles. So she wanted to push that kind of theme forward.
Orla actually just kind of went, well, I can just come up for a weekend.
Yeah, and then when we arrived, it was 40-mile-an-hour winds, and we're like, right, well, that's all we're going to hear, so that's all we're going to record, so that's what we did.
It was fab, because it was a gale. So it meant from the shipping forecast point of view, I got data that I knew would kind of do something. If you listen to the forecast, there's the speed, the wind speed, and the direction, and then the sea state and all of that. When I do the plotting of it, I take the wind speed and the direction, and I basically draw the lines in the direction from the wind is blowing, and I have like a ratio of doing that. So say it's gale force 9 blowing from the north, then it will be a line going down 9 centimetres. And then when it changes direction, it will then go that direction for the length and the speed of the wind. Hence why if it's a gale that's on the shipping forecast, it's good because it's higher numbers, so it goes longer. The thing that I love most about making garments is the pattern cutting. I love that puzzle of working through the shapes and then putting it into a 3D form. So when I look at it, I start to go, oh, okay, that could be an armhole, and that can be a sleeve, and that can be this. But if you've just got one mirrored line, in pattern cutting, when you're working, you're always working in halves. So it was literally like, right, well, if I then mirror that, that becomes then another shape. And then what I do when I'm looking at that, kind of going, right, well, how can that become a garment? Using folding techniques, taking a big piece of fabric and folding it again. And that's where the quilt making side comes in, because when you make kilts, there's a lot of folding techniques and kind of pressing, and you're working again with a huge length of fabric and pushing it all together.
So the shape of the garments were dictated also by the shipping forecast. We use the same pattern for each garment, so they're the same structure, with the 2 different textile concepts.
So there's the big linen piece at the back, which is basically to represent that big piece of cloth with a slit and a cut, and go, look, if you fold this, then it can become one of these 2 things. There's the one that's got all of the sample pieces. When Orla was experimenting, she sent me lots and lots of sample pieces of her screen prints and interpretations and mark making and all of those things, which originally we were going to kind of select from for the final piece, but actually coming to make it, I was like, rather than waste these samples, or not waste them, but rather than have these kind of archived and put into a sketchbook, why don't we use them physically within a garment, and we'd go from there. So I literally did that. I kind of balanced them out into that folding technique that I said about, added more surplus material, I guess is the best way to describe it, that I had in the workshop that went with it. Sample pieces that Orla had made, they worked from a practical point of view, they worked from a zero waste point of view, and they also worked from a design perspective, because it was all tied in.
And then they were stitched together and created into one big piece.
The other one I made up out of calico from the studio, and then sent it to Orla basically, and she then put her screen print onto it.
We've used screen printing, and not necessarily like painting in the traditional sense, but painting directly onto the fabric. So a big part of our project was looking at how to reduce waste. So we've used a bit of screen printing, but the hand painting onto fabric answered that quite nicely, because it uses a lot less ink and you can water it down to make it go further. One garment looks at kind of more emotional response to sound, and the textiles do anyway. So we took their sound recordings, and then I drew in response to them, and also had a look at the spectrogram visuals that these sounds created and drew from that visual as well. So one garment is a fusion of those kind of mark makings, so it's all quite expressive and a bit wild, because we were recording Sounds of the Winds, which were pretty crazy that day.
The soothing sound of hearing the shipping forecast in that voice and that tone is what drew me to it in the first place. Listening to it once I moved up here and understanding the significance of it more so. And then having had the experience of actually recording the sound of what that forecast is predicting.
It was pushing myself creatively, I think, and working with Nikki's kind of concept, because I wouldn't have come up with something like I did had I just been left to my own way of working.
It was an absolute delight to see all of the individual pieces that were created with such a wide kind of set of craft disciplines as well. You know, there was a really wide range of objects that were created. It wasn't like you were just looking at ceramics or you were just looking at textiles. To have all of those different craft disciplines on display at the same time, but with that core element of the sound that underpinned it.
Working with sound in itself has been interesting. It's opened up lots of new ideas, but also the collaborative process has given me more confidence, I think, in going into collaborations, that we can find common ground, and create something completely new that has the mark of both makers on it.
I think it's opened up a whole new world, I think, in terms of I guess inspiration and starting points for projects. The opportunity to meet a lot of different creative people and work alongside them and together with them collaboratively has just been amazing.
One thing I would say about my creative praxis going forward is sound. Sound is going to be equally important, if not more important, than the actual visual part of it, because I think that it's just a really sort of profound way of seeing, because we don't really listen to the world around us. We never stop.
Even just the sounds that were selected, the things that were important to them that they wanted to work with, some of the concepts that came from those discussions as well. Some of the pieces were really conceptually driven, and others were much more about the process of collaborating.
Everything that we've been sharing with our practitioners, we have applied ourselves. I'm incredibly proud of that collaboration and want to hopefully keep on working together in the future as we develop our own practices as artists, as researchers, as designers, and as people in general.